The land agent's horse kicked up a cloud of red dust as it skidded to a stop in front of the Prescott ranch house, and Lionel Prescott was already standing on the porch, arms folded across his chest, jaw set like iron ore freshly pulled from the earth. His eyes, the color of a storm-threatening sky, were fixed on the man dismounting below him with the particular coldness that came not from indifference, but from a fury so deep it had calcified into something terrible and quiet. Mr. Prescott. The land agent, a wiry fellow by the name of Silas Cobb, swept his hat from his head with a flourish that might have seemed respectful if the papers he carried under his other arm had not been dripping with deception. "I've brought the deed transfer for your review, sir. All that's needed now is your signature." Lionel descended one step, just one, deliberate as a judge. "Hand me those papers." Cobb handed them over with a smile that had no warmth behind it whatsoever, the smile of a man who believed he had already won. Lionel read the first page with the measured patience of a man who had survived drought and cattle plague, and the death of his father on this very land. He read the second page, the third, and then he stopped. His jaw tightened. The vein at his temple pressed against the skin like a creek running high after rain. When he looked up, there was something in his expression that made Silas Cobb take one involuntary step backward, which was perhaps the most honest thing Cobb had done since arriving in Laramie County, Wyoming Territory in the spring of 1879. "These numbers are wrong." Lionel's voice was quiet. That particular kind of quiet that carried farther and hit harder than any shout. "The acreage listed here cuts my eastern pasture by 40 acres. The boundary marker described puts the river access inside the county line, not inside my deed." He tapped the paper with one finger. "This is not what was agreed." Cobb opened his mouth. "Do not." Lionel held up one hand. "Do not insult my intelligence, Mr. Cobb. I have the original survey filed with my father's estate. I have the water rights registered in Cheyenne. These papers are altered." He stepped down from the porch fully now, standing in the dust at Cobb's level, and his height suddenly seemed enormous. "Come back with honest papers or do not come back at all." Cobb's smile finally died. He took the papers back, mounted his horse, and rode away down the long rutted track toward the county road without a single word. And Lionel Prescott stood watching until the dust settled, because a man who turned his back too soon on that kind of trouble was a man who would eventually find it embedded in his spine. That confrontation, raw and bristling with the threat of something larger and darker still to come, was the moment that everything changed. But the story of how Lionel Prescott came to be standing on that porch with that particular fire in his chest, and how a woman named Inez Grady came to be the reason the fire was worth keeping burning, began 6 weeks earlier, on a Tuesday morning when the world still felt like it had the decency to operate by honest rules. Wyoming Territory in 1879 was not a forgiving place. The land itself seemed to test you daily, offering up blue skies and golden grasses one morning, and howling wind and frost the next, as if God had not quite made up his mind what to do with this stretch of the continent. The town of Clearwater Crossing sat in the shadow of the Laramie Range, a collection of wooden buildings clustered along a main road that turned to mud in spring and cracked like old bone in August. There was a general store, a telegraph office, a land registry that doubled as a law office, a church whose steeple had been listing slightly westward since a windstorm in 1877, and a saloon that served as the informal meeting ground for every variety of human ambition that passed through the territory. Lionel Prescott had been born 29 years earlier on the land his father had claimed and broken and built from nothing but grit and the refusal to quit. He ran 700 head of cattle now, employed 4 ranch hands, and occupied a house that was, by the standards of Clearwater Crossing, almost grand, with a proper parlor and glass windows and a kitchen stove that had been freighted from St. Louis at considerable expense. He was not a man who talked about his feelings. He was not a man who attended social events unless the occasion demanded it. He was, by the estimation of nearly everyone in town, the most capable and the most solitary rancher in the territory, which was equal parts admirable and deeply sad, depending on who you asked. He had not planned for anything to change that Tuesday morning. He was in town to collect feed supplies from the general store and to drop off a letter at the telegraph office, and the most remarkable thing he expected to encounter was the particular difficulty of loading 50-pound grain sacks onto a flatbed wagon without throwing out his back. What he encountered instead was Inez Grady. She was standing outside the land registry office with a leather satchel clutched to her chest, and an expression on her face that Lionel would later describe to himself, in one of his more honest private moments, as the look of someone who was absolutely refusing to let the world see how frightened they were. She was perhaps 26 years old, with dark hair pinned up under a practical straw hat that had clearly seen better days, wearing a blue cotton dress that was travel-worn at the hem, but pressed neatly everywhere else, which told him she had been traveling long but she had not stopped caring about the dignity of her appearance, and that told him quite a lot about her. She was holding a sheaf of papers out to the man in the doorway of the registry, who was refusing to take them. "I'm telling you, ma'am," the registry clerk was saying, with the particular tone of a small official who has decided that his small power is the most important thing in the room, "the deed to your father's land cannot be transferred without a witness from the county. Your father's signature alone is not sufficient. You'll need to file a probate claim first, and that takes 60 days. "My father died 2 months ago," Inez said, and her voice was perfectly level, perfectly controlled, and somehow more heartbreaking for it. "I have traveled 3 days by train from Denver and another day by stage to be here. I have the deed. I have the death certificate. I have the letter from my father's attorney in Colorado confirming the bequest. What else can you possibly require of me? The 60-day probate period, ma'am, it's the law. The 60 days are nearly complete. His death was registered on the 15th of March. Today is the 14th of May. By tomorrow I am fully within my legal rights." The clerk looked profoundly uncomfortable in the way that men sometimes do when they know a woman is correct and resent her for it. "Well, I can't process the claim today. You'll need to come back tomorrow." Inez held his gaze for a moment that stretched long and taut as a fence wire in winter. Then she said, very quietly, "I will be back tomorrow," and turned away from the door with her satchel still pressed to her chest, and her chin elevated precisely enough to communicate that she was not defeated, only temporarily inconvenienced. She nearly walked directly into Lionel Prescott. He had been standing close enough to hear the exchange, not meaning to eavesdrop, simply being a man who was passing at the wrong or perhaps the right moment on a busy territorial sidewalk, and he caught her by both shoulders when she stumbled backward on the uneven boards. "Steady," he said. She looked up at him. Brown eyes, direct and unafraid, with a brightness in them that was intelligence more than anything else. "Thank you," she said, and stepped back out of his hands with the brisk self-possession of a woman who did not require steadying for long. He was not a man who started conversations with strangers. He had always found small talk to be a particular kind of slow torture, the conversational equivalent of riding into a headwind. But something about the exchange he had witnessed, the combination of her precise argument and that barely concealed vulnerability underneath it, made him say, before he had fully decided to, "That clerk is right about the 60 days. But he's wrong about the witness requirement. Any adult resident of the county can witness the transfer. You don't need an official." She stopped, turned back. "I beg your pardon. It's in the Territorial Code, Chapter 41, I believe. My father had a dispute about it once." He paused. "The clerk knows this. He's making your situation sound more difficult than it is." Her eyes narrowed very slightly, not in suspicion of him, but in the direction of the door she had just turned away from, which told Lionel that she was quick. "Why would he do that?" "I don't know," Lionel said honestly, "but I'd be careful. The land registry office in this town has been under some scrutiny lately." She studied him for a moment. Who are you? Lionel Prescott. I ranch east of town. Inez Grady. She shifted the satchel. My father's name was Thomas Grady. He homesteaded a parcel in the canyon country south of here, about 12 miles out. Perhaps you knew him. Something moved behind Lionel's expression. He had known Thomas Grady. Not well, not closely. But he had known him in the way that ranchers knew their neighbors in isolated country, by reputation, and by the occasional meeting at a cattle auction or a town gathering. Thomas Grady had been a quiet, serious man who ran a small but well-kept spread and minded his own business with a kind of determined integrity that Lionel had always respected. He had died, Lionel had heard, of a fever in early March, which was a cruel way for a strong man to go. He had not known there was a daughter. "I knew your father a little," he said. "I'm sorry for your loss." The composure she had been maintaining flexed just slightly, like a wall that absorbs a blow without falling. "Thank you," she said again, differently this time. He should have tipped his hat and continued on to the feed store. He should have loaded his grain sacks and driven home and let the world manage its own business as it always had. Instead, he heard himself say, "If you need a county resident to witness your deed transfer tomorrow, I'll be in town. I'm at the Prescott Ranch if you need to find me before that." She looked at him for a long moment, the kind of look that takes a real measurement of a person. "That's very kind of you, Mr. Prescott." "It's the lawful thing to do," he said, which was his way of saying yes without saying yes in a way that might require him to examine why he was volunteering. He was halfway down the block when he heard her call after him, "Mr. Prescott." He turned. She was standing exactly where he had left her, the morning sun catching the brim of her hat and the serious set of her jaw. "What is your honest opinion of what just happened in that office?" He considered lying. Not in the way of deception, but in the way of comfortable vagueness, the habit of not wanting to alarm someone unnecessarily. He decided against it, because she had the look of a woman who would prefer the truth to the comfort of ignorance. "I think someone is trying to slow you down," he said. "The question is why?" The lines of her face sharpened. "That is my honest opinion also," she said. He nodded once and went to get his grain sacks. He drove home thinking about the canyon land south of town, and about Thomas Grady's parcel, and about Silas Cobb, who had been nosing around Clearwater Crossing for the past month on behalf of a Denver land company that had been purchasing homestead parcels throughout Laramie County at prices that were, by coincidence or by design, always somehow just below what the land was fairly worth. Lionel had watched this process with the cold attention of a man who sees a pattern forming in something that looks random to everyone else. The canyon land, he knew, sat above an underground water table that fed 2 seasonal springs and 1 permanent creek. In a territory where water was the difference between survival and slow ruin, that was not a small thing. That was, in fact, exactly the kind of thing that might motivate a Denver land company to employ a dishonest clerk and a persuasive land agent. He arrived home and fed the horses and ate his supper alone at the kitchen table, and tried to read the almanac he had been working through for 3 weeks, and found that he could not stop thinking about a pair of brown eyes that had taken his measure and not found him wanting. The next morning he was in town before 8 o'clock, which was earlier than he needed to be for any ranch business. Inez was already at the land registry when he arrived, standing at the counter with her papers laid out in a neat row, arguing in that same precisely controlled voice about the witness clause in Chapter 41 of the Territorial Code, which she had apparently spent the previous evening researching at the town library. Lionel stepped up beside her at the counter. He nodded to the clerk. "I'll witness the transfer," he said. Lionel Prescott, resident of Laramie County, registered voter, landowner of record for the past 11 years. He looked at the clerk with the particular patience of a man who has absolutely no intention of leaving. "Which form do I sign?" The clerk looked deeply unhappy. He produced the form. The deed transfer for the Grady parcel was completed by 8:15 in the morning of May 15, 1879. Outside in the thin spring sunshine, Inez turned to him with an expression that was attempting to be simply professional gratitude but was something warmer than that at the edges. "I am in your debt, Mr. Prescott." "You are not," he said. "You argued your case correctly. I only provided the signature." "The signature you did not have to provide." He said nothing to that, because there was no correct response to it that didn't reveal more than he wanted to reveal at this particular moment. She was looking out at the main street, turning something over in her mind. "I'm going to ride out to my father's land today," she said. "I have not seen it since I was 15. He purchased it the year after I went east with my mother after their separation." She paused. "I need to understand what I've inherited." 12 miles south on the canyon road," he said. "The creek runs year-round on the south pasture. Your father kept good fencing." He had stopped himself before he realized he was going to continue with the thing he had been thinking about all night, the dark possibility that had kept him turning in his bed, and then decided to say it anyway because she had asked for his honest opinion the day before, and she deserved it consistently. "Miss Grady, the land company that's been buying up parcels in this county. Their agent, a man named Silas Cobb, has been very interested in the canyon land. I'd be careful about who you speak to and what you agree to until you've had someone you trust review the full situation." She went very still. "What kind of land company?" "Pacific Western Land and Acquisition. They're out of Denver. They've purchased 4 parcels in the past 8 months, all below fair market value, all under circumstances that, when you look at them closely, involved some form of difficulty with the paperwork or the legal process." He said it steadily, without drama. "I may be wrong about the connection, but I think you should know." She was quiet for a moment, the kind of quiet that means someone is filing information carefully rather than reacting to it. "Thank you for telling me," she said at last. "I will be careful." He tipped his hat and turned to go. "Mr. Prescott," he stopped. She was looking at him with something that might have been the beginning of trust, which was, he would later understand, a much more dangerous thing to give a man than simple attraction. "Would you be willing to ride out to the parcel with me today? I would value a second set of eyes from someone who knows this land." He should have said that he had a ranch to run and cattle to move and 47 other things that needed doing before nightfall. He said, "I'll get my horse." The ride south through the canyon country was one of those mornings that Wyoming produces in May, like a promise of what the whole summer might be if you were lucky. The air sharp and clean off the mountains. The grasses running green and gold across the flats. The canyon walls rising red and amber on the western side with shadows still pooled at their bases. They rode mostly in silence, which might have been awkward with anyone else but wasn't, because it was the silence of 2 people who were comfortable with their own thoughts and didn't feel the need to fill space with noise. He learned things about her from what she said and what she didn't say. She had grown up in Denver after leaving Wyoming. She had trained as a school teacher and had taught for 3 years in a small school on the edge of the city. Her mother had died the previous autumn, 2 months before her father, which meant she had buried both her parents in the space of a season. She said this last part without asking for any particular response, simply stating it as the fact it was. But he caught the faint tightening around her eyes and understood that the weight of it was enormous, and she was carrying it entirely on her own. When they reached the Grady parcel, she pulled her horse to a stop at the ridge above the canyon and looked down at the spread of it, the small house and the outbuildings and the pasture running south to the creek, and he watched her face change. Not break, but change. Something soft and old came into it, the way places from childhood do to people when they return to them after a long absence, carrying all the years of distance and loss. "He kept it so tidy," she said softly. "Look at the fencing." He looked. The fencing was indeed excellent, tight and well-maintained, the kind that took consistent attention and care. Thomas Grady had not let things go. He had tended this land until he could no longer do so. They rode down. The house was small but solid, built of good timber with a stone foundation, which spoke of a man who built for permanence rather than convenience. Inside, everything was in order, which was both touching and heartbreaking in its way, the home of a man who had not expected to die, who had left his reading glasses on the table and his boots by the door and a half-finished carving on the windowsill. Inez picked up the carving, held it for a moment, set it down. "I need to decide what to do with all of this," she said. "What are your options?" he asked, because it seemed the useful question. She was quiet for a moment, walking slowly around the main room, touching things with a light hand. "I can sell it, take what I get for it and go back to Denver and continue teaching." She paused. "Or I can stay, try to run it, learn what I don't know." She turned to face him. "I was a school teacher, Mr. Prescott. I am not a rancher." "Your father wasn't a rancher when he started either," he said. She looked at him with an expression he couldn't quite categorize. Not quite a smile, but related to one. "That's either encouraging or wildly optimistic, possibly both." That was the first time he heard her laugh. It was brief and genuine and slightly surprised, as if she had not expected to find anything worth laughing at today, and it hit him somewhere in the region of his chest, with a force that he was entirely unprepared for. He spent the afternoon walking the property with her, checking the fencing, assessing the condition of the outbuildings, looking at the cattle, a small but healthy herd of about 30 head that had been well managed. She asked intelligent questions and listened carefully to his answers, and pushed back when she disagreed with his assessments, which happened twice, and both times she was right, which he respected enormously. By the time they rode back toward town in the long golden light of late afternoon, something had shifted between them. He could feel it in the way the silences had changed, less careful and more comfortable, the way they had begun to read each other's pauses. "I'm going to stay," she said, as they reached the point where the canyon road met the county road. "I've decided," he nodded. He had expected her to say that. "I'll need help," she said. "Not charity, help I can pay for. Labor and knowledge, and the kind of honest advice that someone gives you when they're not trying to profit from your ignorance." She looked at him with a direct clarity that he found in equal measures unnerving and deeply admirable. "Are there people in this county I can trust for that?" "Some," he said. "I'll introduce you." She studied him for a moment. "Why are you being so helpful, Mr. Prescott?" It was a fair question, and she deserved a fair answer. He thought about it for a moment honestly. "Your father was a good man," he said at last, "and I think someone is trying to take what's his." She held his gaze. "And," he looked ahead at the road, because it was easier than looking at her while he said it, "and I think you have more right to be here than most." She didn't say anything to that. But when he glanced sideways at her, she was looking at the horizon with an expression that told him she had heard the full weight of what he'd said, and she was keeping it safe. Over the following 3 weeks, Inez threw herself into the work of learning her inheritance with an intensity that impressed everyone who witnessed it, and alarmed several people who had expected her to sell up and leave. She was up before dawn, working the horses and the cattle with a mixture of inherited instinct and rapidly acquired knowledge. She hired a ranch hand named Elias, a weathered and thoroughly competent man of 40 who had worked for her father the last 2 years, and who stayed on for her with an obvious loyalty that told her her father had been the kind of employer worth being loyal to. She came to Lionel's ranch 3 times in those first weeks, each time on a specific question about water rights or grazing rotation or the best farrier in the county. He answered each question fully and directly, and found himself, by the 3rd visit, watching the clock in the hour before she was due to arrive with an irritation at himself that he recognized as the symptom of something he was not yet willing to name. His ranch hands noticed. His foreman, a broad, good-humored Texan named Gil Marcos, mentioned it once with the careful obliqueness of a man who wanted to say something but valued his employment. "That Miss Grady rides real well," he said, after her 3rd visit, watching her disappear down the road. "For someone who says she's new to ranching." "She is new to ranching," Lionel said. "She don't ride like she's new to anything," Gil said pleasantly, and went back to work. Lionel thought about that for the rest of the day. On a Wednesday in the last week of May, Inez rode to his ranch with a different kind of urgency in her face. It was not the urgency of a practical question but of a genuine alarm, and she had it well contained but not entirely. She handed him a letter before she dismounted. He read it standing by the corral fence, one hand on the top rail, reading the letter twice, the first time quickly and the second time slowly. It was from Pacific Western Land and Acquisition, addressed to Inez Grady, property owner of record. It expressed the company's interest in purchasing the Grady parcel at a price that was, on its face, seemingly reasonable but which Lionel knew, because he knew this land, was approximately 60% of what the property was worth considering the water access. The letter was signed by a company representative in Denver and made reference to a Mr. Silas Cobb as their on-the-ground contact in Laramie County. "He's already been to see you?" Lionel asked. "Yesterday morning. He came to the house." Her voice was steady but her hands were not entirely, which was perhaps the most honest indicator of how rattled she actually was. "He was very polite. He said the company had great respect for my father's work and wanted to ensure I wasn't burdened with the responsibilities of running a ranch on my own." She paused. "He made it sound very much like he was doing me a favor." "That's how they operate," Lionel said. He folded the letter and handed it back to her. "Did he mention the springs?" She looked at him sharply. "No, he wouldn't. The two seasonal springs on the canyon land and the permanent creek together represent the most reliable water access in the southern part of the county. A land company that controls that access controls the development of anything south of Clearwater Crossing for the next generation." He said it without drama, simply as geography and economics. "That's what they're buying." The full weight of it settled over her. He could see it happening, the calculation of what she had without knowing it and how many people might want to take it from her. "My father knew this," she said slowly. "He must have known." "I believe he did, and I believe he chose not to sell, which is possibly why he had unexplained difficulties with his water permit renewals in 1877 and 1878. He had been thinking about this since May 15th, since the moment he understood the pattern, and the saying of it out loud felt both necessary and grim. She was very quiet. "You think someone was pressuring him?" "I think the pattern of what happened to him looks like pressure," he said carefully. "I can't prove the connection, but I think you should be cautious." The silence held between them for a moment, full of the implications of everything said and unsaid. Then she lifted her chin in that characteristic way, the gesture he had come to associate with her decision to face something rather than retreat from it, and said, "What would you do, if it were your land?" "I'd tell them to come back with honest papers or not to come back at all," he said. "And then I'd make sure my legal documentation was airtight and my water rights were fully registered so that when they pushed there was nothing for them to grip." She studied him. "Will you help me?" "Yes," he said. There was no hesitation this time. The next 2 weeks were the most concentrated collaborative effort either of them had ever engaged in. Inez traveled to Cheyenne with Lionel to file the full water rights documentation with the territorial government, a 2-day journey that involved the stagecoach and a stay at separate hotels, and a great deal of very focused work at the territorial land office, and a great deal of other time that was somehow both productive and the most enjoyable 2 days Lionel had spent in years. She was remarkable company. She was funny, in a dry, understated way that sneaked up on you. She was curious about everything, asking questions with genuine interest rather than the social performance of interest. She was honest in a way that occasionally caught him off guard, saying directly what she thought about a situation without the usual social varnish. And he was slowly and somewhat helplessly coming to understand beautiful, not in the conventional decorative sense of a china figure, but in the way of something real and particular, a face that had character and expression and changed constantly as she thought. On the second evening in Cheyenne, they sat in the hotel dining room after a long day of official filings and ate a proper meal with actual tablecloths, which was a novelty after weeks of camp cooking and grain store suppers, and talked for 3 hours about things that had nothing to do with land rights or water permits. About books, about the nature of this territory and whether it would become a state in their lifetimes. About what it meant to build something, whether a ranch or a school or a life, in a place that was still being decided. "Do you ever feel," she said, setting down her coffee cup and looking at him with the particular directness that always meant she was about to say something real, "like the land owns you as much as you own it?" He thought about it. "Yes," he said, "but I don't experience that as a burden." "Nor do I," she said quietly, and he understood she was talking about the canyon parcel now, about the decision she had made to stay, about the 3-week process of binding herself to her father's land and her father's work. "It frightened me at first, the attachment. I was afraid it was a trap." She paused. "A trap made of grief mostly. Staying not because I chose to, but because I couldn't bear to let go of the last thing he'd built." "And now?" he asked, not because he needed to know, but because he wanted to hear her say it. She smiled, small and sure. "Now I know I'd choose it regardless." They rode back to Clearwater Crossing on the 3rd day with a leather folder full of perfectly filed, fully legal, airtight documentation for the Grady parcel's water rights. And Lionel felt something he was not accustomed to feeling, which was the particular lightness of having done something that mattered alongside someone he was glad to be alongside. It was on the ride back, somewhere in the long afternoon stretch of the canyon road, that the thing he had been carefully not naming for 6 weeks finally made its presence known in the only way it could be ignored no longer, which was by Inez's horse stumbling on a loose rock and her grabbing the reins and recovering easily, and Lionel's heart performing a brief, involuntary, entirely unreasonable act of terror at the half-second of potential danger, before she was clearly fine and smiling slightly at her own horse's clumsiness. And he understood with the cold clarity of a man who has run out of ways to argue with himself that he was in love with her. He said nothing about it. He was, as Gil had once told him with good-humored frankness, better at managing a cattle drought than managing his own emotional interior, and he had no intention of adding that particular complication to a situation that was already complicated enough. Silas Cobb arrived at the Prescott Ranch on a Wednesday morning in mid-June, which was how the story arrived at its beginning. He came with the altered papers. He came with the smooth, professional smile of a man who had done this before, in other counties, to other landowners, always relying on the complexity of the legal language and the assumption that people in the territory wouldn't know what they were looking at. He had made the assumption that Lionel Prescott, for all his obvious capability as a rancher, would not have a precise understanding of acreage surveys and water rights boundary language. He had made the wrong assumption. Lionel read the papers with 3 weeks of careful preparation behind his eyes. He saw the altered acreage immediately. He saw the shifted boundary marker that would have placed the eastern spring outside the Prescott deed. He saw the small, perfectly printed deception that, if signed, would have cost him 40 acres and a water source, and approximately 30 years of carefully maintained legal ground. And he told Silas Cobb to come back with honest papers or not to come back at all. Cobb rode away down the rutted road. Lionel watched the dust settle. Then he saddled his horse and rode 12 miles south to the canyon parcel. He needed to tell Inez what had happened, because if Cobb had brought altered papers to him, he would bring altered papers to her, or something worse, and she needed to know that the situation had moved from potential pressure to active fraud. He found her in the east pasture with Elias, checking the fence line along the creek. She saw him coming from a distance, and something in his pace or expression told her it was serious, because she handed Elias the post driver and walked out to meet him rather than waiting. He told her about the papers. He told her about the altered acreage and the boundary deception and the specific nature of what Cobb had attempted. He watched her face go through several things in quick succession, understanding, anger, and then a particular cold clarity that he recognized as her version of the same thing he had felt on his porch that morning, the decision to meet this fully. "He'll come here next," she said. "He will. What do I do when he does?" Lionel thought about it carefully. "You refuse any papers he brings until they've been reviewed by someone you trust against your filed documents. You do not sign anything without that review, and you make it clear, very clear, that you know exactly what your land is worth and what your rights are. And if the pressure continues," she asked it without fear, simply wanting to know the full terrain, "then we take what we have to the territorial attorney's office in Cheyenne. The altered papers I was shown today are evidence of fraud." "If he shows you altered papers as well, that's a pattern." He paused. "There may be other landowners in the county who received similar treatment and didn't know what they were looking at. This might be larger than just your parcel and mine." She absorbed this. "Do you have the papers he brought you?" He reached into his coat and produced them, folded but intact. "I made him leave them," he said, "partly because he had no right to take evidence of his own fraud with him, and partly because I knew I might need them." She took the papers and looked at them with the concentrated attention of someone reading for specific details rather than general impression. "The boundary description is wrong in 3 specific places," she said after a moment. "I know the survey language because I've been reading the original Prescott deed, the one your father filed because it borders my father's eastern pasture." He stared at her. "You've been reading my father's deed." "I've been reading every property filing in the South County from the past 30 years, she said, without any particular self-consciousness. "I wanted to understand the full land history. Is that strange?" "No," he said, and he meant it in more dimensions than just the practical one. "No, that's not strange at all." She looked up from the papers and found him looking at her in a way that was slightly different from the way he usually looked at her, which she noticed because she had been noticing everything about him with an accuracy she had not intended and could no longer entirely manage. She looked back at the papers. "We should compare these against my father's survey map. If the boundary shift here is consistent with the shift on your deed, then this is a systematic alteration, not a one-time mistake." "Yes," he said, because she was right and because it was easier than addressing the other thing. They spent 2 hours at her kitchen table with her father's survey maps and the documents she had accumulated over the past weeks, and they found it. The boundary alteration on Lionel's offered deed matched exactly a proposed boundary in a Pacific Western land and acquisition filing from 1878, which had been rejected by the Territorial Land Office, but had apparently never been abandoned. Someone inside the company or the county land registry had access to the filed surveys and was systematically shifting them in the fraudulent deeds being offered to property owners. "This is not Cobb acting alone," Inez said, tracing the line on the map with one finger. "Someone in an office somewhere knows exactly where the boundaries should be and is deliberately altering them." "Which means there's a chain of complicity," Lionel said. "The registry clerk who delayed your filing, Cobb, someone at Pacific Western." She leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, which he had come to understand was her thinking posture. "We need to file a formal fraud complaint with the territorial attorney. We need to do it before Cobb makes another approach so that when he does, we're already on record." She looked at him. "Will you go to Cheyenne again with me?" "When do you want to leave?" he said. She almost smiled. "You don't even ask questions anymore." "The questions I have aren't about whether to help," he said. The directness surprised him, the way it had come out more plainly than he intended, and he saw her register it, the faint change in her expression that was not discomfort but something else. "What questions do you have?" she asked quietly. He looked at her for a long moment. The kitchen was full of late afternoon light, and the smell of coffee and the accumulated evidence of a woman who had arrived 6 weeks ago with a travel-worn satchel and was now so thoroughly present in this place that it seemed unimaginable that she had not always been here. "Some questions can wait," he said. She held his gaze. "Some questions probably shouldn't wait too long," she said, and there was something deliberate and gentle in the way she said it that made the air between them feel different, charged with the particular electricity of two careful people who have been circling something and have finally come close enough to feel its warmth. He took a breath. Miss Grady. Inez. Her name in his mouth felt like something he had been saying for years rather than weeks. I need you to know that everything I've done here, the witnessing, the water rights, coming out today, none of it was because I expected anything from you. I want to be clear about that. I know, she said simply. That's exactly why I trust you. What I mean to say, he continued, because he had started and stopping now would be a kind of cowardice, and Lionel Prescott was not a coward, is that I have developed feelings for you that are well beyond, that are entirely, he stopped, started again. I care about you, in a way that has nothing to do with your land or your father or the legal situation, in a way that I did not expect and have not managed well. He looked at his hands on the table, then back at her. I'm not a man who says these things easily, so I'm not saying them easily. I'm saying them because they're true and you deserve to have them said directly. The silence lasted one heartbeat. 2. Then Inez Grady reached across the table and put her hand over his, and the warmth of it was so immediate and real that he had to consciously not react as visibly as he wanted to. Lionel, she said, and it was the first time she had used his given name without any qualifier. I left Denver on a stagecoach 6 weeks ago with a dead father's deed and $40 to my name and the vague idea that I might stay for a season and then decide. I have no intention of leaving. She turned her hand over under his so that her fingers interlocked with his fingers. That is substantially your fault. He looked at her. My fault. Being exactly what you are, she said, without any apparent awareness of how rare that is. He turned his hand properly, holding hers, and looked at her face in the late afternoon light and thought that he had spent 29 years building something on this land and had not known until right now that the most important part of it had been missing. I would like to come calling, he said formally, because some things deserved formality. If that suits you. She laughed, that real, brief, genuine laugh. You have been coming to my ranch several times a week and riding 12 miles to bring me information and traveling to Cheyenne with me and sitting at my kitchen table for an hour, she said. I think the calling has already commenced. Officially, he said. Yes, she said, with a softness that was nothing like her customary precision, and was, for that reason, the most honest thing he had heard from her yet. Officially. They rode to Cheyenne the following Monday, this time staying 3 days. They filed the fraud complaint with the territorial attorney's office on the first day, presenting the altered deed Lionel had retained, the comparison survey maps Inez had assembled, and a written account of the registry clerk's behavior during her original filing attempt. The territorial attorney, a brisk and thorough man named Hargreaves, read their materials with increasing intensity and then looked up and said, I've had reports from 2 other counties about Pacific Western's methods. This is the first time I've had documentation this solid. On the second day, a territorial investigator came to take their formal statements. By the third day, there was a preliminary investigation opened into Pacific Western land and acquisitions activities in Wyoming Territory, with Silas Cobb named as a person of interest. On the third evening, they walked along the boardwalk near the Capitol building in Cheyenne in the blue hour after sunset, not talking about land fraud or documentation or territorial law, but about the ordinary private things that 2 people share when they are becoming important to each other. He told her about his father, the kind of man he had been, the specific quality of his honesty that had shaped Lionel's own. She told him about her childhood on the canyon land before her parents separated, the way the Red Canyon walls had been the defining geography of her first memories, and how coming back to them had felt like rediscovering a part of herself she hadn't known was lost. He took her hand as they walked, and she leaned slightly toward him in the easy, natural way of someone who has decided that proximity to a particular person is a pleasure rather than a risk. I want to ask you something, she said. Ask it. When you told Cobb to come back with honest papers or not to come back at all, she looked up at him. Were you afraid? He considered the question seriously. Not of Cobb, he said. Of what comes after people like Cobb, the legal disputes, the pressure that doesn't stop just because you've said no once. He paused, but not in the way that made me want to bend. No, she said quietly. I didn't think so. Were you? He asked. She was quiet for a moment. Yes, she said honestly. I was afraid of the whole of it, of staying and being pressed and not being strong enough. I'm still a little afraid of that. You're stronger than you think, he said. People say that. She tilted her head. You actually believe it. I've watched you for 6 weeks, he said. I have evidence. She smiled at the ground, and in the dim blue light of the street, he thought he had never in his life seen anything as worth protecting as that smile. They came home to Clearwater Crossing on Thursday morning to find that the situation had developed in their absence. Silas Cobb had been to Inez's property again, this time when only Elias was present. Elias had turned him away with the particular firmness of a man who was protective of his employer, and Cobb had left, but not before making a comment to Elias about how the lady might find the legal situation more complicated than she expects once the full county record is reviewed. He's threatening something, Elias told them. I don't know what. Lionel went to the land registry the same afternoon and reviewed the county records with the particular focused attention of a man who has spent 3 days in a territorial legal office and has learned what to look for. He found it in an hour, a proposed easement filing from 1876, predating the Grady parcel's water rights registration, that would have given a right-of-way across the canyon land to a now-defunct mining company. The filing had been rejected and officially voided, but it had not been removed from the active files. If someone wanted to use it as a weapon, they could create confusion about whether it had been properly voided, tying up the property in dispute long enough to force a distressed sale. It was exactly the kind of document that Cobb had been hinting at. He took a copy and rode to Inez's ranch. She listened to his explanation without interrupting, which was one of the things he admired most about her, the quality of her listening, the way she gave information her full attention before responding. When he finished, she said, but it was formally voided. In 1876, but the voiding order is in a separate file and someone has made sure the 2 files are not cross-referenced. Someone at the registry, most likely. She stood up from the table and walked to the window and looked out at the pasture and the creek line. What do? We file a formal notice with the Territorial Land Office that the easement was voided with the full voiding documentation so that there is an official cross-reference in the active record. He laid the copies he had made on the table. I also think we should speak to the other landowners in the South County who may have received approaches from Pacific Western. If we can document a pattern to present to Hargreaves, the fraud case becomes substantially stronger. She turned back from the window. How many ranches are we talking about? 6, possibly 7 that I know of. She looked at the papers on the table, then at him. Then we have work to do. Over the next 10 days, they rode together to every homestead and ranch in the South County that Lionel suspected had been approached by Pacific Western. They found in most cases exactly what they feared. Approaches had been made, confusing documents had been shown, and in 2 cases, sales had already been completed at prices that the families had not known were well below market value. In one case, a widow named Mrs. Almina Hawks had been told that her deed had a fatal defect that made a sale her best option, which was a lie that had cost her 80 acres at half their worth. Mrs. Hawks was 63 years old, sharp-eyed and furious when she understood what had been done to her, and she became the most committed member of the informal coalition of landowners that Lionel and Inez assembled to bring their collective evidence to the territorial attorney. Inez organized the documentation. It was an enormous amount of work, detailed and demanding, requiring her to read and cross-reference dozens of legal filings, and she did it with a thoroughness that astonished Lionel and which he eventually said so. I taught school for 3 years, she reminded him with the slight arch of an eyebrow. Organizing large amounts of detailed information is something I have some experience with. I should hire you, he said. She looked at him sidelong. You can barely keep yourself from being defrauded. Your organizational skills are, with the greatest of respect, not your strongest quality. He laughed, which surprised both of them because he was not a man who laughed frequently or easily, and she turned to look at him with an expression of pleased discovery, as if she had found something she had been hoping existed. I like that, she said softly. What? When you laugh, she said simply. It sounds like something you meant to do. He looked at her for a long moment. You're changing me, he said, and it came out with a directness that was beyond his usual careful measure, raw and true and slightly alarmed. I notice things I didn't used to notice. I think about things I didn't used to think about. She was very still. Is that bad? No, he said. It's disorienting, but no. She put down the papers she was holding and turned toward him with a deliberateness that made his breath come slightly shorter. And she put both hands on his face and kissed him, which was not a tentative or uncertain thing but a clear and decided thing, the act of someone who had made up their mind and was not interested in being anything less than honest about it. He kissed her back with everything he had, which was substantial, and held her as though she were both very precious and entirely capable of taking care of herself, which was exactly the right way to hold her. When they separated, she looked at him with an expression that was the clearest and most open thing he had ever seen on her face. All the careful control and the precise management of impression finally set aside in favor of something that was purely, directly, entirely real. Lionel Prescott, she said, I am very much in love with you. He exhaled as though he had been holding that breath for 6 weeks. I am extremely, completely in love with you, he said. I have been since you argued Chapter 41 of the Territorial Code to a county clerk, and were entirely correct about it. She laughed and leaned her forehead against his chest, and he wrapped both arms around her and held her in the afternoon light streaming through the kitchen window of her father's house, while the papers documenting 6 months of systematic land fraud lay on the table beside them, and the permanent creek ran through the east pasture with the steady, unhurried permanence of something that has always been there and intends to continue. The territorial investigation moved with more speed than Lionel had dared hope, largely because Hargreaves was a thorough man who found systematic fraud personally offensive, and because the documentation that Inez had assembled was, as he put it, the clearest paper trail I have seen in 17 years of territorial law. Silas Cobb was formally charged with fraud and misrepresentation in early July. The registry clerk, whose complicity became apparent during the investigation, was removed from his position and faced his own charges. The investigation into Pacific Western land and acquisition expanded to 3 territories and eventually produced findings that were significant enough to result in the company's Wyoming operations being suspended, and 2 of its Denver executives facing federal charges for wire fraud. Mrs. Almina Hawk's sale was reviewed, and she received compensation for the difference between what she had been paid and the fair market value of her land, arranged through a territorial court order against Pacific Western's remaining assets. It was not the full sum she should have received, but it was substantial, and when she received the bank draft she looked at it for a long time and then looked at Inez and said, "Your father would have been proud of you, child." Inez held herself together until she was alone in the wagon driving home, and then she cried quietly for most of the 12-mile ride, not in grief exactly, but in the particular release of a tension that had been carried too long. And when she arrived home and found Lionel there, who had come by with the news that the final documentation had been filed and everything was complete, she got down from the wagon and walked straight to him and put her arms around him and said nothing at all. He held her and said nothing either. Sometimes nothing is the precisely correct thing. Lionel Prescott asked Inez Grady to marry him on a Saturday evening in August, 1879, standing on the ridge above the canyon pasture at sunset with the Laramie Range turning purple and gold behind them and the creek catching the last light below. He asked simply and directly, in the way he did everything that mattered, without theatrical preparation or excessive ceremony, just the true, unvarnished fact of what he wanted and why. "I want to build a life with you," he said. "Not because it would be practical or convenient, or because it would simplify the legal complications of adjacent properties. Because I cannot imagine my life being what it should be without you in it. Because you are the most honest, capable, infuriating, extraordinary person I have encountered in 29 years of meeting people, and I do not want to spend a single more season doing any of this without you." She looked at him in the fading light with her brown eyes full of everything she was and had decided to be, the woman who had come from Denver with $40 and her father's deed, and had built, in the space of 4 months, a life out of loss and stubbornness and love. "Yes," she said. "Obviously, yes." He put his grandmother's ring on her finger, a simple gold band with a small garnet that had come west from Pennsylvania in a velvet pouch, inside his grandmother's traveling trunk 40 years ago, and she looked at it on her hand against the failing sunset light, with an expression of such quiet, complete happiness that he had to look away for a moment at the horizon to collect himself. They were married in October in the Listing Church, whose steeple had been straightened slightly by the efforts of Gil and Elias and 2 other ranch hands the previous summer in what everyone understood to be a preparatory gesture. The whole of Clearwater Crossing came, and Mrs. Hawks sat in the front row and cried happily, and Gil Marcos gave a toast that was slightly longer than necessary but heartfelt in every syllable. The ceremony was simple and the vows were the traditional ones, but when Lionel said, "I will," and looked at Inez, it carried the weight of everything he had meant and everything he had not been able to say out loud for months, and she heard all of it. She kissed him after the pronouncement with the same decided, unhesitating honesty with which she had kissed him in her kitchen that afternoon, and the congregation, collectively and without embarrassment, made the kind of approving sound that communities make when they have watched 2 people find each other and are genuinely glad. The winter of 1879 to 1880 was a hard one, as winters in Wyoming Territory tended to be, with storms that drove the temperature below anything comfortable for weeks at a stretch, and demanded the full attention of anyone who was trying to keep livestock alive. Lionel and Inez worked through it side by side, and it was the kind of test that strips away everything that is not essential and reveals the actual shape of a marriage, whether it holds under pressure, whether the partnership is real or only comfortable in easy weather. It held. It held in the way that good fencing holds, not because it never faces strain, but because it was built correctly and the posts are set deep enough. They managed both ranches through the winter, running the herds together on the better-sheltered canyon pastures on Inez's land, and using the more substantial facilities at Lionel's ranch for the operations that required them. What had begun as a practical arrangement started to feel, by December, like the natural configuration of a life that had always been meant to occupy this combined space. In January, on a quiet evening by the kitchen stove with snow pressing against the windows and a pot of coffee on and a book each on the table, Inez said, "I think we should discuss what we do with 2 properties that are, practically speaking, operated as one." He looked up from the almanac he was reading. "What are you thinking?" "I'm thinking that the canyon parcel has the water access and the summer grazing, and your place has the infrastructure and the established operation. Separately, they're each viable. Together, they're considerably more than that." She looked at him steadily. "I don't want to fold my father's land into yours. I want them to remain distinct in the records. His name should stay on that deed." "Agreed," he said immediately. "But operationally," she continued, "I think we manage them together as one ranch under both names, Grady Prescott or Prescott Grady, whichever order you prefer." He thought about it for less than a moment. "Grady Prescott," he said. "Your father built his first." She looked at him with the expression he had come to know as her version of being profoundly moved. "Grady Prescott it is." In February, she told him she was pregnant. He was standing by the water pump in the yard when she came out to tell him, her coat wrapped tight against the cold, her face carrying that particular controlled expression that meant she was managing something enormous. She told him directly and waited for his response with the smallest detectable trace of uncertainty, as if even now she was not entirely sure how the world would respond to her. He crossed the yard to her in 3 steps and held her face in both his cold hands and looked at her with everything he had, all the feeling he had spent his whole adult life being too careful with, unguarded and fully present. "We're going to have a child," he said. "We are," she confirmed. He held her for a long time in the cold yard with the snow around them, and the cattle moving in the distance, and the particular knowledge that this, right here, was what everything had been building toward. Their son was born in October of 1880, delivered in the ranch house with the capable assistance of the doctor from Clearwater Crossing and Mrs. Hawks, who had appointed herself the family's unofficial grandmother figure, with a decisiveness that no one had thought to argue with. He was a healthy, loud, opinionated infant who announced his presence in the world with remarkable volume, and looked at everything with Inez's direct, measuring brown eyes. They named him Thomas Lionel Grady Prescott. Thomas for the grandfather who had built the canyon land and held onto it with stubborn integrity against every pressure to let go. Lionel for the father who had stood on his porch and refused to let deception win. Inez held the baby in the lamplight of the bedroom and Lionel sat beside her on the edge of the bed, and they looked at this new person who had arrived out of everything they had built together, and there was nothing that needed saying that wasn't already present in the room. By the spring of 1881, the Grady Prescott operation was one of the most efficiently run ranches in Laramie County, which people attributed to various things, but which Lionel privately understood to be primarily attributable to Inez, whose talent for organization and strategic thinking had transformed what had been a capable but somewhat improvised operation into something genuinely excellent. She had modernized the record-keeping, developed a rotation system for the combined pastures that produced measurably better yields, and established a relationship with a cattle buyer in Cheyenne that had increased their annual revenue by 1/3. She had also started a small lending library in Clearwater Crossing, operating out of a back room at the general store, stocked with donated and purchased books, which she ran with the same precision and care she brought to everything. It was, she said, because she could not entirely abandon her schoolteacher impulses, and because the children in this county deserved access to books regardless of how far from a proper school they lived. Lionel had funded the book purchases without comment, because it was the right thing to do, and because watching Inez organize the shelves with the absorbed pleasure of someone in her proper element was worth the cost a dozen times over. That spring, a letter arrived from the territorial attorney's office. It informed them that the investigation into Pacific Western land and acquisition had concluded, that the company had been formally dissolved in Wyoming Territory, and that all fraudulently obtained land transactions had been reviewed. 3 additional sales had been unwound entirely, and the properties returned to their original owners, and the compensation fund from Pacific Western's seized assets had distributed payments to 11 affected landowners across the territory. Inez read the letter at the breakfast table and set it down and looked out the window at the morning light on the yard, where young Thomas was taking his first uncertain steps between the fence posts with Elias close by for support. "It's done," she said. "It's done," Lionel confirmed. She looked at him across the table with her coffee cup in her hands and the morning light making everything warm. "Your father would have been satisfied with how this went," she said. "He thought about that. About his father, who had built this land from nothing and kept it with stubborn, honest work through every difficulty the territory had produced. About Thomas Grady, who had done the same in the canyon country, about the particular inheritance that was not just land and water rights but the integrity of how you held it. He would have liked you enormously, Lionel said. She smiled at him. I hope so. He would have said you argue too well, Lionel said, and meant it as the highest possible compliment. She laughed. Then we would have gotten along perfectly. Thomas Lionel Grady Prescott learned to walk that spring, which was a process that involved remarkable determination and absolutely no fear of falling. He fell frequently. He got up every time immediately, with the instinctive resilience of someone who had been born to two people who had never let falling be the final word. Inez watched him do this one afternoon from the porch, shading her eyes against the bright May sun, and Lionel stood beside her and she said, "He's going to be stubborn." "He comes by it honestly," Lionel said. "From both sides," she agreed, and leaned against him in the easy, permanent way of a woman who has found the right place to be and knows it. In the summer of 1882, a newspaper reporter from the Cheyenne Daily Leader rode out to interview Inez about the role she had played in the Pacific Western investigation. Because the story had grown in the territory to the point where people were talking about it, as an example of what ordinary citizens could accomplish through careful documentation and persistence. The reporter was young and enthusiastic and asked questions with the breathless energy of someone who expected dramatic stories. Inez gave him the facts precisely, without embellishment or self-promotion, and credited Lionel, Mrs. Hawks, Elias, and the territorial attorney equally. When the reporter asked her, somewhat romantically, whether she had been afraid when she realized the scale of the fraud she was facing, she said, "Afraid would not be quite the right word. Determined would be closer. I had inherited land that my father had worked and protected for 20 years. The question of whether I would do the same was not actually a difficult one." The reporter then asked Lionel, who had been standing at the fence across the yard, with the studied indifference of a man who would rather be anywhere else than in an interview, whether it had been his faith in Inez's legal abilities that had led him to support her. Lionel was quiet for a moment, and then he walked across the yard and stood beside Inez in a way that was both entirely natural and unmistakably protective, and said, "My faith in everything about her led me to support her. The legal abilities were evident from the first 5 minutes. The rest took slightly longer to fully appreciate, but not much." The reporter wrote it down with the slightly dazed expression of someone who had come for a legal drama and gotten a love story. The article appeared 2 weeks later and was the most widely read piece the Cheyenne Daily Leader published that summer. Mrs. Hawks bought 4 copies and sent them to relatives in Kansas. In the autumn of 1883, their second child arrived, a daughter they named Clara Rose Grady Prescott, who was born with a remarkable quantity of dark hair, and an expression of absolute opinion about the world that made Lionel laugh out loud in the delivery room, which the doctor said he had never encountered before from a new father, and which Inez said from her position of exhausted triumph was entirely appropriate. Thomas, now 3, regarded his sister with the mixture of suspicion and fascination that older children bring to the arrival of siblings, and within a week had decided that she was his personal responsibility, which he took extremely seriously from that point forward. The ranch continued to grow and improve. By 1884, the Grady Prescott operation had expanded to nearly 1,000 head of cattle and had established a reputation for quality that commanded premium prices at the Cheyenne market. Lionel had upgraded the ranch infrastructure significantly, and Inez had expanded the lending library to a proper reading room that she shared with the church on alternating days. The territory was becoming a state. The conversations about Wyoming statehood that had been theoretical when Lionel and Inez had discussed them in that hotel dining room in Cheyenne in 1879 were becoming practical, and the particular character of the place was shifting as more people arrived and more of the open spaces were claimed. It was both wonderful and bittersweet, as all forward movement tends to be, because some of what was lost was the particular quality of open wildness that had defined this place, and some of what was gained was the stability and legal protection that made the kind of fraud Pacific Western had practiced significantly harder. Mrs. Almina Hawks died in 1885, peacefully and with her affairs in good order, having spent the last years of her life as a figure of considerable local stature due to her role in the Pacific Western investigation and her habit of expressing her opinions with magnificent clarity. She left her property to a niece in Nebraska and a small sum to the Clearwater Crossing Lending Library, which Inez received with tears she did not attempt to hide. They attended the funeral together and drove home slowly in the late afternoon, and Inez held Lionel's hand the whole way without speaking, and he let her have the silence, which was what she needed, and that capacity for knowing what she needed without being told was, she had told him once, one of the things she loved most about him. In 1887, their third child arrived, a son they named James Edmund Grady Prescott, who arrived with the same volume and decisiveness as his older brother, and who immediately established himself as a person of considerable presence. Thomas, now 7, took him on as an additional responsibility with the particular gravity of an eldest child who considers himself substantially in charge of everything. Clara, at 4, decided James was primarily a source of interesting chaos and approved of his presence on those grounds. The house had been expanded twice since their marriage to accommodate what was becoming a genuine family, and it was full in the way that houses become full when they are genuinely lived in, with books and boots and the evidence of children and the particular warmth of a place where the people inside it are glad to be there. Lionel sat on the porch one September evening while the children were in bed, and the last light was leaving the sky over the Laramie Range, and Inez came out with 2 cups of coffee and sat beside him in the other chair, the one that had been placed there specifically for her presence, and they watched the stars appear over the mountains in the way they had learned to watch them together over 8 years of evenings. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Ask it," she said, which was his line, and she had borrowed it from him years ago with a small private smile. "Are you happy?" He asked it simply, without any anxiety attached to it, just the genuine question of a man who wanted to know the truth of the thing. She looked at the stars for a moment. "Do you remember the day you found me outside the land registry office?" "Yes. I had traveled 3 days and had $40 and a dead man's deed, and I was absolutely terrified that this would all be taken from me before I had even properly arrived." She sipped her coffee. "And now I have this." She made a small gesture that encompassed everything, the ranch, the night sky, the children asleep inside him beside her. "I am not simply happy. I am the kind of settled and full and deeply, genuinely content that I did not know was actually available. I thought people described this in books to give others something to hope for." She looked at him, and it turned out to be real. He reached across and took her hand, the same hand he had held on dozens of carriage rides and fence-walking mornings and Cheyenne trips and ordinary evenings, the hand with his grandmother's gold ring and the garnet that caught the light on good days. "It turned out to be real," he agreed. Wyoming became a state in July of 1890, and Clearwater Crossing celebrated with a town gathering that lasted 2 days and involved more food than was strictly necessary and enough noise to be heard from the canyon road. The Grady Prescott family attended in full, which by that point included Thomas at 10, Clara at 7, James at 3, and a 4th child expected in November, whose arrival everyone in the family was managing their anticipation of in their individual characteristic way. Thomas was practically organized about it, already planning where the new baby would sleep and what responsibilities he could appropriately delegate. Clara had opinions about names. James, at 3, had declared that the baby would be named Horse, which he considered an excellent name, and had not yet been fully redirected on this point. Inez stood at the edge of the celebration in the main street of Clearwater, crossing on Wyoming's first day as a state, with the July sun on her face and the noise of celebration around her. And Lionel came to stand beside her with a plate of food, and handed it to her with the easy domestic competence of a man who has spent 11 years learning exactly how to be married to a particular person. "Wyoming," she said. "Wyoming," he confirmed. She looked at the main street with its wooden buildings and the still slightly listing church and the general store where the lending library had started, and the land registry office where a nervous clerk had once tried to tell her that her documentation was insufficient, and she thought about the shape of the last 11 years, the arc of it, the specific set of unexpected turns and deeply intended choices that had brought her from a Denver schoolroom to this exact moment in this exact place. "I never thanked you properly," she said. He looked at her. "For what?" "For coming back," she said. "That morning at the registry, you didn't have to come back. You told me about the witness clause and you could have walked away and let me handle it myself, and that would have been perfectly sufficient, but you came back." He was quiet for a moment. "I couldn't walk away," he said. "I had no good reason that I could articulate at the time, but I couldn't walk away." "I know," she said. "That's exactly why I'm thanking you." He put his arm around her shoulders and she leaned into him. And around them the state of Wyoming celebrated itself in the warm July afternoon. And the Grady Prescott Ranch sat 12 miles south with the creek running through the east pasture, and the cattle in the canyon meadow, and the house full of books, and the accumulated life of two people who had found each other in a moment of crisis, and had chosen, repeatedly and deliberately and with full knowledge of what they were doing, to build something true. Their fourth child arrived in November, a son they named William Henry Grady Prescott, who arrived in the world with a contemplative expression that made Inez say he looked like he was already considering something important, and who disproved James's suggestion of naming him Horse, which James accepted with more grace than anyone had expected, possibly because at 3 he had already forgotten making the suggestion. The winter of 1890 was mild by Wyoming standards, which everyone understood to be a gift. By spring of 1891, the Grady Prescott Ranch had a reputation that extended well beyond Laramie County, and Lionel received inquiries occasionally from ranchers in other territories about their methods. He answered them when he had the time, because his father had taught him that the honest sharing of what works is not a competitive disadvantage, but a contribution to the kind of world worth living in. Inez received a letter in April from the Clearwater Crossing School Board, asking if she would be willing to serve as the school's official reading instructor for 2 mornings a week, in addition to maintaining the lending library. She accepted without hesitation and began that September, and the particular pleasure she took in teaching again was visible to everyone who knew her, a kind of fulfillment running beneath everything else, additional and complementary to the life she had built. Thomas Lionel Grady Prescott, at 11, was already demonstrably going to be a rancher. He had the instinctive relationship with the land and the animals that some people are simply born with, and he spent every hour he could outdoors working alongside his father and Elias, who was still with the ranch 20 years after helping Thomas Grady, and who regarded the Prescott children with the affectionate disapproval of a man who has known them since birth and has strong opinions about their development. Clara Rose Grady Prescott, at 8, was a reader of voracious and indiscriminate appetite who consumed everything in the lending library without particular preference for subject, and who showed early signs of her mother's precise argumentative ability, which Lionel considered a matter for the world to deal with when it arrived, and admired enormously in the meantime. James Edmund was still primarily chaos in a small body, which was consistent with everything that had been true about him from the beginning, and William Henry maintained the thoughtful contemplative expression he had arrived with, and was, at 6 months old, the most patient infant anyone in the family had encountered, which Inez said was God's compensation for the other 3. On a May morning in 1891, Lionel rode the boundary fence of the eastern pasture as he did every spring, checking the winter's work on the posts and the wire, the annual accounting of what had held and what needed attention. He rode the full perimeter, 12 miles, in the way his father had done and his father before him, the particular relationship between a man and the land he has committed his life to, understood not in abstraction, but in the specific physical knowledge of every rise and low point and water channel and fence corner. He stopped at the ridge above the canyon pasture, the ridge where he had asked Inez to marry him, and looked out at the view that had not changed in the essential way of true things, the mountains behind, the creek below, the canyon walls catching the morning light in that particular combination of red and gold that you never quite grew accustomed to no matter how many thousand mornings you had watched it. And coming up the canyon road from the ranch house, on the bay mare she had owned for 6 years, was Inez, riding out to meet him with the easy confidence of someone who knows exactly where they are going, and behind her, on the smaller horse that had been Thomas's first solo mount, was Thomas himself, at 11 already riding with his father's upright seat and his mother's directness of purpose. She pulled up beside him on the ridge and looked at the same view, and Thomas stopped on his other side and they sat there for a moment, the three of them, with the Wyoming morning all around, and the ranch below and everything that had been built between them and beneath them and ahead of them. The work not finished because work of this kind is never finished, only continued, passed from hand to hand down the years. "We should check the south fence this morning," Inez said, practically. "We should," he agreed. Thomas said, "I already checked the south corner yesterday. The wire's good, but the third post from the creek needs resetting." Lionel looked at his son. "You checked it yesterday." "Elias showed me how to check it properly," Thomas said, with the particular pride of someone who has learned a useful thing. "I wrote down everything that needed doing." Inez looked at Lionel with the small private smile that was entirely theirs, the one that said simultaneously, "Can you believe him? And of course we can believe him, and isn't that exactly right?" "All right then," Lionel said. "We'll start with the third post from the creek." They rode down from the ridge together, into the ordinary, extraordinary work of the life they had made, and the sun came fully up over the Laramie Range, and the creek ran below, and the land held them, as land that has been honestly earned and honestly kept will hold you, with the deep, steady permanence of something that has decided you belong to it, which is perhaps not so different from love after all. The spring continued mild, and the summer came on clean and strong, and the Grady Prescott Ranch entered another year of what it had always been and was becoming, which was something built to last. And at the center of it, as solid and true as the stone foundation under Thomas Grady's original house in the canyon, was the fact of Lionel and Inez, the quiet daily chosen fact of them, which required no drama to sustain it and gathered no dust, only deepened with the years like good timber or honest water or the particular kind of love that is built on telling the truth and refusing to bend and coming back, always coming back, with honest papers or not at all.